The river thundered through the valley, swollen by snowmelt, its surface foaming white where rocks split the current. In the moonlight, something unnatural bobbed between the waves, a wooden crate, battered and half submerged. It spun and slammed against a boulder before continuing downstream, carrying with it a muffled sound, faint but desperate. Anyone else might have mistaken it for the wail of the wind. Elias Carter knew better. Elias had lived long enough in the wilderness to separate the cry of an owl from the sob of a human voice. He stood on the ridge above the river, breath clouding in the cold spring air. His hound Boone stiff beside him, ears pointed forward. Boone barked once, sharp and urgent. Elias's gut tightened. He had chosen the life of a mountain man to escape the demands of people, but he could not ignore that sound. He threw off his coat, trudged down the slope, and felt the ground give beneath his boots where snowmelt had soaked the earth. The roar of the river grew louder, drowning out the beat of his own heart. He spotted the crate again, swirling in an eddy before it lurched toward a rapid. Without pausing, Elias plunged into the water. The current struck like a hammer, icy and merciless. He fought for footing, legs braced against slick stones. With a grunt, he caught the crate, nearly dragged under with it. Summoning the stubborn strength that had kept him alive in these mountains, he heaved it toward the bank. Boone barked wildly, circling until Elias hauled the box onto the mud. The crate was nailed shut. River water streamed from its seams. Elias ripped out his knife and pried the planks apart. Inside, wrapped in sodden blankets, lay a girl, no more than 7, her lips blue, her small hands trembling. Her eyes opened weakly, wide with fear yet clinging to life. "Sweet mercy," Elias muttered, cutting away the cloth that bound her. The girl tried to speak. He bent low, listening over the rush of the river. A single word escaped her cracked lips. "Home." Then her eyes fluttered closed, and her body went limp. Elias lifted her into his arms. She was feather-light, chilled to the bone. Boone pressed close as they climbed the slope toward the cabin hidden among the pines. Inside, Elias laid her near the hearth, fed the fire until sparks leapt high and wrapped her in dry furs. For long minutes he watched her chest, waiting for each breath, fearing the next might not come. The night dragged on, but she held on, though her sleep was restless. Elias sat with his back against the wall, staring at the flames. Questions burned in his mind. Who would seal a child in a crate and cast her into the river? Was it cruelty, desperation, or something darker? And why had fate placed her in his path when he had sworn to carry no burden but his own? He rubbed the scar across his forearm, the mark of a life he had abandoned, guns, blood, vengeance. The man he used to be had no place in the quiet of these mountains. Yet the girl's cry echoed in his memory, sharper than the howling wind. Home. By dawn, pale light slipped through the cracks of the log walls. The girl stirred slightly, her small hand tightening around the fur as though clinging to life itself. Elias poured black coffee into a tin cup, staring into its steam. He had survived years alone, but he knew in his bones that the solitude he had built so carefully had ended the moment he pulled her from the water. For those drawn to stories of survival, resilience, and the unforgiving truths of the Old West, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Many more tales wait, each carrying the grit and heart of a world that tested every soul who dared to live in it. Yet here, in one lonely cabin along a raging river, a story had begun that would change Elias Carter forever. The morning sun pushed its way through thin clouds, casting pale light over the cabin. Elias sat on a stool beside the hearth, running a whetstone along his knife, though his mind was fixed on the small figure sleeping under a pile of furs. Boone lay stretched on the floor, his head on his paws, eyes never straying far from the girl. The river had nearly claimed her, yet here she was, breathing, alive, though her face was still drawn and pale. When she stirred, Elias set the knife aside and leaned forward. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, revealing eyes the color of dark chestnuts. She blinked at the smoke-stained beams of the cabin before settling her gaze on him. "You're safe," Elias said, his voice gruff from disuse. "You're in my cabin. No river's going to carry you off now." The girl didn't speak, She only pulled the furs tighter around her shoulders, eyes fixed on him as though weighing whether he was friend or foe. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, lips parted, then whispered, "Clara." The sound of it stirred something in Elias. A name made her real, no longer just a bundle of rags from the river. Clara. He repeated it in his mind, grounding himself in the responsibility that name carried. "Well, Clara," he said, "you're a lucky one, or a current like that don't usually spare folks." Her small hand moved toward her chest, fumbling beneath the fur. She pulled out a locket hanging from a thin, tarnished chain. She clutched it tightly, as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. Elias leaned closer, noticing the initials carved faintly into the silver, RM. "That yours?" he asked. Clara nodded. Her lips trembled, and for a moment Elias thought she might cry, but no tears came. She just pressed the locket harder against her chest and looked at him with wide, solemn eyes. "Where's your home?" Elias asked softly. Clara opened her mouth, then closed it. She shook her head slowly as though the effort of remembering was too heavy. Only one word escaped, the same she had spoken the night before, but now steadier. "Home." Elias rubbed his beard, uneasy. She was alive, yes, but she was also lost, adrift in more ways than one. He was no nursemaid, no guardian. He had built his life to keep away from such ties. Yet every time he looked at her, he felt the old wound of loss stir again, a reminder of the family he had once buried in the ashes of violence. Boone barked suddenly, snapping Elias from his thoughts. Clara flinched and pulled the furs tighter. Elias reached over, patting the hound's head. "Easy, boy. She ain't no threat." Silence settled again, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Elias rose, stirred a pot of beans, and ladled some into a tin bowl. He placed it before Clara with a wooden spoon. She stared at it for a moment before picking up the spoon with trembling fingers. Slowly, she began to eat, her eyes never leaving him. Watching her, Elias felt the weight of decision pressing down. He could leave her at the nearest settlement, hand her off to strangers, and return to his solitude. It would be the simplest way. Yet something in her eyes, something desperate, trusting, made that thought harder to hold on to. As she finished the last of the beans, she spoke again, voice hoarse but firm. "Don't leave me." The words hit him harder than the river's current had. Elias swallowed, his throat tight. He didn't answer, not yet. Instead, he reached for his coat and stepped outside, needing the sharp mountain air to clear his thoughts. Boone followed, tail low, as though sensing his master's turmoil. The mountains loomed high and unyielding, snow still clinging to their crowns. The river roared below, carrying secrets away. Elias knew he couldn't ignore what fate had set at his door. The mystery of Clara, who she was, where she came from, and why she had been cast into the river, would not let him rest. And whether he wanted it or not, he was already part of it. The fire burned low, sending thin smoke curling toward the rafters. Elias sat on the edge of the bunk, sharpening his knife out of habit, though his thoughts wandered far from the steel in his hands. Clara slept quietly for once, her breathing steady. Boone curled at her feet. In the stillness, memories long buried began to claw their way back into his mind. It had been more than a decade since Elias Carter had walked away from the world of men. Once his name had been known across the frontier, whispered with a mix of respect and caution. He had been quick with a Colt, quicker than most, and carried himself with the hard edge of a man who'd lost more than he'd ever won. But speed and steel had never shielded him from the cruel hand of fate. He remembered the night his cabin in Missouri had burned, flames licking the sky, the sound of gunshots ripping through the dark. Raiders had come for cattle, but they'd taken far more. His wife, Sarah, and their young son, Daniel, never made it out. Elias had fought until the barrel of his rifle ran hot, but he had been too far from them, too late to save what mattered. By dawn, the fire had left nothing but charred timbers and ashes that stank of ruin. That night had marked him. Afterward, the man who had lived by the gun kept carrying it, but every pull of the trigger cut deeper into what remained of his soul. He drifted across towns and territories, leaving behind bodies and empty whiskey bottles, until one morning he looked into a saloon mirror and no longer recognized the hollow eyes staring back. That was when he had turned his back on it all. He walked into the mountains and swore never again to be chained to another soul. Now sitting in the dim cabin with a child who clung to life by the fire, Elias felt that oath crack like thin ice. Clara's wide eyes, the locket she guarded, the single word she had spoken with such fragile hope, home, had reached into the place he had buried long ago. He told himself she was just another stray carried by the current, nothing to bind him. Yet when she had whispered, "Don't leave me," it had cut deeper than any blade. Boone lifted his head and gave a low whine, breaking Elias's thoughts. The hound's gaze flicked toward Clara, as if reminding his master that she was still there, flesh and blood, not a ghost from the past. Elias sighed and set the knife aside. He rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the rough stubble and the weight pressing down heavier than the mountains outside. The girl stirred, half awake, murmuring in her sleep. Elias leaned closer, but her words were lost in the crackle of the fire. She turned, clutching the furs tighter, as though holding onto something that kept slipping away. Watching her, Elias felt the old wound in his chest reopen, the helplessness of knowing someone small and fragile depended on him, and the terror of failing again. "Damn it all," he muttered under his breath, standing to pace the floor. The cabin creaked with every step, the sound loud in the quiet night. He had thought he could wall himself off forever, but fate had a way of forcing open doors a man thought locked for good. Elias paused at the window. The moon hung low over the ridge, casting silver light across the river. He wondered if the water had carried Clara from some distant homestead, or if darker hands had meant for her never to reach land at all. The questions burned at him, but the answers lay far beyond the safety of his mountain refuge. He turned back to the fire. Clara slept on, Boone guarding her like a sentinel. Elias knew he could not carry her burden for long without facing what waited beyond the pines. Yet for now, in this fragile moment, he forced the memories back into the shadows and sat down beside the fire, keeping watch as dawn crept closer. The morning broke clear and sharp, the mountains glowing rose and gold under the first touch of sunlight. Elias stepped outside, the cold air biting his face, and scanned the valley below. The river still roared, swollen with snowmelt, a reminder of how close the girl had come to vanishing forever. Boone padded at his side, nose low to the ground, tail wagging faintly. Behind him, Clara sat on the cabin's threshold, wrapped in a wool blanket, her eyes wide at the wilderness that stretched endlessly around her. She had color back in her cheeks now, though the hollowness of hunger still showed in her thin frame. Elias handed her a tin cup filled with warm broth and crouched beside her. "Best get something in you," he said. "Out here, food's what keeps you on your feet." She sipped, wincing at the heat, but didn't complain. Boone came to sniff her hand, and she managed a small smile, patting his head with a timid touch. Elias watched the exchange in silence, struck by how quickly the hound had taken to her. Boone had never trusted strangers, yet here he was, leaning against the girl as though he'd known her all his life. Later, Elias led Clara to the edge of the clearing. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the ground soft beneath their boots. He pointed toward a set of paw prints pressed into the mud. "Wolves came through last night," he said. "Hunting the same as me." Clara's eyes grew round. "Do they come close?" "Close enough if you don't keep fire burning," Elias replied. He crouched beside her, tracing the tracks with one calloused finger. "But wolves are like men, hungry, desperate, always looking for weakness. Show none and they'll think twice." She nodded slowly, though her grip on the blanket tightened. Elias straightened, motioning for her to follow as he checked his traps along the ridge. Clara trailed behind, watching every move. He showed her where the snares were set, how to read the bent grass and faint trails left by rabbits. At each stop, Boone sniffed ahead, tail stiff, alert to every sound. By midday, Elias had a pair of rabbits hanging from his belt. Back at the cabin, he skinned them with practiced hands, the knife flashing in the sun. Clara sat nearby, watching intently. "Does it bother you?" he asked, glancing at her. She shook her head, though her eyes lingered on the small, lifeless forms. "No, just sad." Elias grunted. "Sad, maybe. But out here, sadness don't fill your belly. You learn quick, or the land swallows you." That evening, as the stew bubbled over the fire, Clara ventured further from the cabin. She picked up a stick and scratched shapes into the dirt. Boone followed her, playful now, snapping at the stick as she dragged it along. For the first time since he had found her, Elias heard her laugh, a soft, fleeting sound, but real. It caught him off guard, stirring something he had nearly forgotten existed. After supper, Clara sat near the hearth, staring at the flames. I remember water," she whispered suddenly. Elias looked up from cleaning his rifle. Her small voice wavered, and men shouting. "My mama was crying. Then it was dark." She clutched the locket around her neck, pressing it tight against her chest. Elias waited, but no more words came. She only shook her head, eyes clouded with fear. "You don't have to tell it all now," he said quietly. "In time, maybe." Clara nodded, her gaze never leaving the fire. Elias leaned back, the weight of her words pressing on him. He had tried to wall himself off from the world, but the frontier was not a place where a man could carry two lives, his own and a child's, without being tested. As night deepened, the wolves howled in the distance, long and mournful. Clara shifted closer to him, her eyes wide. Elias rested a steady hand on her shoulder. The wilderness was harsh, unforgiving, but he knew then that he would face it with her, whether he was ready or not. The spring thaw lingered in the air, damp and sharp, when Elias decided it was time to break his long habit of solitude. Clara needed more than the cabin and his company. She needed medicine, clothes that fit, and perhaps, though the thought sat heavy in his chest, a chance to find her kin. The nearest settlement lay a half-day's ride south, Fort Bridger, where traders, ranchers, and drifters crossed paths on their way deeper into the frontier. Elias saddled his mule, a stubborn beast named Amos, while Clara stood close by, her locket glinting in the morning light. Boone danced around them, eager for the trail. Clara tilted her face toward him, eyes cautious but steady. "Are we going far?" she asked. "Far enough," Elias answered. He adjusted the packs. "Towns where we'll find what you need." Clara climbed onto the mule with his help, settling into the worn saddle. She held the horn tightly, looking both nervous and excited. Boone barked, circling before falling in beside them, as Elias led the way down the narrow path carved through pines and rock. The land shifted as they rode, dense forest giving way to rolling hills dotted with sagebrush. Smoke from distant camps rose into the clear sky. Clara stared at everything, wide-eyed at the vastness, as though each tree and ridge were a story waiting to be told. When they reached the outskirts of Fort Bridger, the noise struck her first. Wagons rattled, horses snorted, hammers rang from the blacksmith's forge. Voices mingled, traders haggling, soldiers barking orders, women calling children. Clara clutched the saddle horn tighter, the life and bustle of the place overwhelming after days in the quiet wild. Elias guided Amos through the main street, drawing curious eyes. He was no stranger to suspicion. His weathered face, broad shoulders, and the revolver at his hip marked him as a man apart. Murmurs followed him, but he ignored them, keeping his gaze steady. Clara sat tall, though her eyes darted nervously at the stairs. At the general store, Elias lifted her down and tied the mule. The smell of leather, flour, and tobacco hung in the air as they stepped inside. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, grey hair pinned neatly, spectacles perched on her nose. She looked first at Elias, guarded, then softened when she saw Clara. "Well now," the woman said kindly, "you've brought a little one with you." "Haven't seen that in years." "This is Clara," Elias said, his voice low. "Needs clothes, something proper for her size." The woman, who introduced herself as Martha Green, bustled around the shelves, gathering garments, boots, and a shawl. Clara's face brightened as she tried on a bonnet, tilting it toward the dusty mirror with shy delight. Martha crouched beside her, adjusting the ribbon beneath her chin. "You're a sweet one," Martha said warmly. "Where's your home, dear?" Clara hesitated, glancing at Elias. She opened her mouth but only whispered, "Home," before falling silent. Martha's brows knit, but she didn't press. Instead, she looked back at Elias, something cautious in her eyes. "Not many children find themselves out here alone," she said quietly. "If there's trouble, folks ought to know." Elias gave a curt nod, his jaw tight. "She'll have what she needs." After paying, he and Clara stepped outside into the sunlight. The girl clutched her new shawl around her shoulders, smiling faintly as Boone nuzzled her hand. But Elias felt the weight of Martha's words. The town's eyes had noticed Clara, and eyes had a way of carrying whispers far. As they mounted up to leave, Clara turned back toward the bustle of Fort Bridger, her face thoughtful. Elias studied her, uneasy. The town had given her warmth and kindness for a moment, but beneath the surface he could already feel questions stirring. Questions that might not bring peace. They rode north again, the mountains rising like guardians in the distance. Clara leaned against him in the saddle, silent, but her small hand found his arm and held fast. Elias looked down at her, a strange ache stirring in his chest. The wilderness waited, but so did shadows he could not yet name. The days after their visit to Fort Bridger carried a different weight. Elias noticed it first in the way strangers' eyes lingered too long, or how conversations hushed as he and Clara passed by. The wilderness gave a man solitude, but a town bred curiosity, and curiosity often turned to trouble. One afternoon, Elias tethered Amos outside the trading post while Clara sat on the steps, clutching her shawl. Inside, he bartered pelts for salt and flour. The chatter around him shifted when his name slipped into it. He didn't have to hear the words clearly. The tone was enough. Men glanced at him, then at each other, their eyes drifting toward the girl waiting outside. When Elias stepped out, Clara rose quickly, relief on her face. Boone growled low, hackles raised. A pair of ranch hands leaned against the hitching rail, boots muddy, whiskey sour on their breath. One of them, a thick-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, spat into the dirt and smirked. "Fine little prize you got there, Carter," the man drawled. "Don't recall you ever keeping company that young before." Elias fixed him with a stare cold as stone. "Best keep your tongue," the man chuckled, nudging his companion. "Word is, Crate floated downriver last week. Folks whisper a girl was inside. Wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Clara pressed closer to Elias, her hand gripping his coat. Elias's jaw tightened. "You hear too much whiskey talk," he said evenly. The man's smile faded into something meaner. "Funny thing, though. Some say that girl's tied to land disputes. Big rancher south of here lost a daughter once, Robert McAllister. You know the name, I reckon." At that, Elias felt the weight settle heavier. McAllister was no small rancher. His cattle and men stretched across valleys like a kingdom. A man like him had influence, and influence meant power. If Clara bore any tie to that family, it explained why she'd been cast into the river, an obstacle swept aside for inheritance or ambition, but Elias gave nothing away. He lifted Clara into the saddle and mounted behind her. "Best keep your nose in your own trough," he said, voice low. "Some questions cut deeper than you're ready for." The man laughed, but there was no mirth in it. "Careful, mountain man. Folks'll think you're hiding something." Elias nudged Amos forward, Boone trotting at their heels. Clara remained silent until the town was far behind, her small fingers still clutching his sleeve. "Who were those men?" she asked finally, her voice fragile. "Just fools with too much drink," Elias replied. He kept his tone steady, though inside he turned the words over. "Fools, yes, but fools sometimes carried whispers from sharper tongues." That night in the cabin, Elias sat by the fire while Clara dozed under her blanket. Boone lay at the door, ears twitching at every distant sound. Elias stared into the flames, replaying the ranch hand's words. McAllister land disputes a missing daughter. He didn't know if the whispers were true, but the pieces fit too neatly to ignore. He reached for his rifle, running his hand along the stock. The old instinct rose in him, the readiness to defend what mattered, yet the thought chilled him. He had walked away from the world of power and greed, the kind of world men like McAllister ruled. To step back into it meant stepping into a storm that would not end clean. Clara stirred and sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Elias?" He turned to her, softening his expression. "What is it, girl?" "Are we safe here?" she asked. Her voice carried the tremor of a child who already knew the answer. Elias hesitated, then nodded. "Safe as a body can be this side of the mountains." Clara laid back down, though sleep did not come quickly. Elias kept watch long into the night, the howls of wolves rising from the ridge. He knew the wolves of the wild. They followed instinct, hunger. The wolves of men were worse. They followed power, greed, and whispers that carried the promise of ruin. The days stretched into a rhythm, mountain air crisp with the scent of pine and melting snow. Clara followed Elias through his routines, her small steps determined to match his long stride. Where once she had watched with timid silence, now she asked questions with the bright curiosity of a child rediscovering trust. "Why does Boone howl at night?" she asked one evening, tugging at the dog's ear as he sprawled beside the fire. "Same reason men talk in their sleep," Elias replied, whittling a piece of wood into a fishing lure. "Dreams need air now and then." Clara giggled softly, the sound filling corners of the cabin that had long stood silent. Elias found himself listening for it, surprised at how it warmed him more than the fire ever could. He began teaching her skills he thought any child of the frontier should know. On mornings clear enough to see the peaks against the sky, he placed a small rod in her hands and guided her at the riverbank. "Hold steady," he instructed, adjusting her grip. "Fish don't care for clumsy hands." Clara bit her lip, concentrating as she cast the line. Boone splashed nearby, scattering minnows, and she scolded him with a laugh. When at last she pulled a small trout from the water, she jumped with excitement. "Look, Elias, I did it!" He smiled faintly, taking the fish to clean. "Reckon you'll eat better than most settlers before long." Evenings brought quieter lessons. Elias showed her how to string traps, mend gear, and whistle signals Boone obeyed. Clara absorbed each detail with wide-eyed determination. She was no longer the shivering child from the river, but a girl learning to stand firmer on uncertain ground. Yet there were moments when shadows returned to her eyes. Sometimes at night she woke with a gasp, clutching her locket, whispering words Elias couldn't make out. He would sit beside her, waiting until her breathing calmed, but never pressed her with questions. The past clung to her like smoke, and he knew better than anyone that some memories came loose only when a person was ready. One afternoon, while splitting wood, Elias heard her call. He turned to see Clara astride Boone, clutching his fur as the hound trotted proudly around the clearing. She waved at him, her bonnet slipping sideways. "Look at me, I'm riding." Elias shook his head but couldn't hide his grin. "That mutt ain't no pony." "Feels the same to me," Clara answered, her laugh echoing against the ridge. For a brief moment, Elias let himself believe that maybe fate had given him a second chance, though he dared not name it. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara leaned against him without a word. Her small voice came at last, quiet but steady. "Elias, you feel like a pa." The words stopped him cold. His hand froze over the wood he was carving. Images of Daniel, his own boy, flashed before him, eyes bright with the same innocent trust, now long buried beneath ash and memory. His throat tightened. "I ain't your pa, Clara," he said gruffly, "but I'll keep you safe as I'm able." She looked up at him, eyes shining in the firelight. "That's enough for me." He turned away, pretending to stir the stew, but inside something shifted, old grief rubbing against fragile hope. Boone raised his head, sensing the change, then settled again as though satisfied. Later, when Clara dozed off with her head resting on his arm, Elias sat motionless, afraid to break the spell. Outside, coyotes yipped across the valley, their cries sharp and wild, but inside the cabin there was peace he had not known in years. Still, as he watched the flames dance low, Elias knew such peace could not last. The world had a way of testing bonds, just as the wilderness tested survival. And with Clara's presence came both warmth and danger, threads now tightly wound together. The wind swept across the valley with the bite of early summer storms, rattling the pines around Elias's cabin. He sat at the table, oil lamp flickering, while Clara traced patterns in the wood grain with her finger. The silence between them held weight, for Elias had spent the past days sifting through whispers he'd gathered in town. Too many of those whispers carried one name: McAllister. Clara looked up at him, her locket glinting as it swung on its chain. "Do you know who R.M. is?" she asked suddenly, surprising him. Elias studied her closely. "Why do you ask?" She held up the locket. "It's carved here. I thought maybe you knew." His hand tightened around the mug of coffee before he set it down. "Robert McAllister owns more cattle than most men could count. Ranch spreads wide in the southern valleys. He's rich, powerful, and used to getting what he wants." Clara tilted her head. "And what does that have to do with me?" Elias exhaled slowly. "That's what I'm trying to reckon." The truth gnawed at him. From Martha Green's hushed voice to the ranch hand's drunken jab, all roads pointed to McAllister. If Clara bore his name, then the river had not taken her by accident. Later that week, Elias returned to Fort Bridger for supplies, leaving Clara with Boone and strict instructions not to stray from the cabin. The general store was quiet when he entered, Martha alone behind the counter. She looked up sharply as though she'd been waiting. "Carter," she said, lowering her voice. "I've been meaning to speak with you." Elias nodded once. "Go on." She adjusted her spectacles. "I heard you've been asking about McAllister. Best be careful. That family's shadow stretches far." "I don't scare easy," Elias said, though his tone carried no boast. Martha leaned forward. "Years back, McAllister's first wife passed, giving birth to a daughter. Folks say he cherished the child, but when he remarried, things changed. His new wife never took to the girl. There were whispers, arguments, jealousy over inheritance. Some even feared harm might come to the child if it meant clearing the way for her own kin." Elias's jaw tightened. The pieces fit too well with the crate in the river. "You saying Clara belongs to him?" Martha lowered her voice further. "I can't say for certain, but the locket and her face, she's got the look of the McAllisters, same eyes his first wife carried." Elias felt the ground tilt beneath him. He had taken Clara from the river thinking she was a cast-off soul with no name. Now it seemed she might carry a legacy drenched in wealth and danger. "Does McAllister know she's alive?" he asked. Martha shook her head. If he did, she'd already be back under his roof, or buried where no one would find her. The words lodged in Elias's chest like a stone. He left the store without another word, the weight of responsibility pressing harder with every step. That evening, Clara waited by the fire when he returned. She searched his face, sensing his unrest. "Did you find out something?" Elias crouched beside her, meeting her gaze. "Maybe, but some truths ain't easy, Clara. You got to be strong enough to hear them when the time comes." She clutched the locket again, her voice trembling. "Is it about my family?" Elias hesitated. "Yes. But I need more than whispers before I tell you." The girl nodded slowly, her trust in him unshaken. Boone curled at her side, ears twitching at the storm outside. Elias stared into the flames, knowing full well that the storm beyond the cabin walls was not the one he should fear. The name McAllister was more dangerous than wolves or weather. And whether Clara's blood tied her to that man or not, others would stop at nothing to keep the truth buried. The sun had barely crested the ridge when Elias sensed it, an unease in the air that no wind could carry. Boone had been restless since dawn, nose to the ground, ears pricked at sounds only he could hear. Clara noticed it too. She stayed close to Elias, clutching her shawl as if the wool could shield her from the weight pressing down over the valley. They rode to the creek to check snares, but Elias's eyes were never still. He had lived too long in the wilderness not to know when he was being shadowed. Tracks told the story plain. More than one rider had passed through the trees during the night, keeping distance but circling close enough to watch. "Elias," Clara asked, her voice small as she followed his gaze across the timberline. "Keep steady, girl," he murmured. "Ain't nothing yet but shadows." Still, he carried his rifle loose in the crook of his arm as they made their way back to the cabin. Boone growled low, the sound rumbling in his chest. Elias felt his jaw tighten. Whoever trailed them had patience, and patience meant purpose. That evening, as dusk settled and the fire glowed inside the cabin, a knock rattled the door. Boone leapt to his feet, teeth bared. Clara gasped, clinging to Elias's arm. He motioned her back, then swung the door open with his rifle ready. A man stood there, tall and lean, dust clinging to his black coat. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but his smile was thin and sharp. "Evening, Carter," the stranger said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Heard tell you're keeping company that don't rightly belong to you." Elias didn't lower the rifle. "If you've got business, speak it plain." The man tipped his hat slightly, revealing a face lined with scars and eyes too calm for comfort. "Name's Harlan. I ride for Mr. McAllister. He sends his regards. And a warning. That girl, Clara, isn't it? She ain't yours to keep. Best turn her loose before trouble finds you both." Clara gasped behind him, her hand clutching the locket. Elias felt the old fire rise in his chest, the one he had tried so long to bury. "She was near drowned when I found her," he said evenly. "If McAllister wanted her safe, he had a strange way of showing it." Harlan's smile widened, just enough to reveal a glint of teeth. "Safe? That depends on what safe means. Mr. McAllister's house is big, walls thick, men loyal. She'd be looked after there. Out here," he gestured at the cabin. "Out here, wolves and worse will pick her bones clean." Elias stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "Out here she's breathing because I pulled her from the river. No thanks to McAllister or his kind." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by Boone's growl. Then Harlan leaned forward slightly, his tone turning colder. "I'll say it once more, Mountain Man. Let her go or you'll both vanish into the river same as she nearly did. Some things ain't worth fighting for." Elias held his gaze without flinching. "You best ride back and tell McAllister this. If he wants the girl, he can come say it to my face." Harlan studied him for a long beat, then chuckled low. "Suit yourself." "But rivers have a way of carrying more than logs downstream. Sometimes they carry bodies, too." With that, he turned, mounted his horse, and disappeared into the gathering dark. Clara rushed to Elias's side, fear trembling in her voice. "He wants to take me back, doesn't he?" Elias rested a hand on her shoulder, steady as stone. "Don't you fret. You're with me now. Nobody's taking you anywhere you don't want to go." Yet as he closed the door, the echo of Harlan's warning gnawed at him. The wilderness was harsh, but men like McAllister were harsher. And Elias knew the fight he had long avoided was coming fast, carried on the back of threats that left no room for peace. Fort Bridger bustled with its usual mix of wagon wheels, cattle calls, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. But to Elias the noise carried a sharper edge. Clara clung to his side as they walked down the main street, Boone padding close, hackles raised at every unfamiliar glance. Since Harlan's visit, Elias had felt eyes following them in every shadow, whispers clinging to their trail like burrs. He had come to town for one reason, to look McAllister in the eye. Avoiding him no longer felt like an option. Too many voices tied Clara's name to his, and too much danger hung over them both. The saloon was the only place McAllister might be found at this hour. Elias tied Amos outside and guided Clara to the general store, where Martha Green stepped out quickly, concern etched on her face. "Elias," she hissed, glancing toward the saloon. "Don't do this. McAllister's men are thick in there." Elias's eyes narrowed. "I've run from shadows long enough. Time I see the man himself." Martha looked down at Clara, who clutched her shawl tightly, fear plain in her eyes. She reached to squeeze the girl's hand. "Stay with me, darling, just for now." Clara hesitated, then nodded, releasing Elias's arm with visible reluctance. He crouched to meet her gaze. "I won't be long," he said softly. "Trust me," she whispered. "Come back," her grip tightening before she let go. With Boone at his heel, Elias pushed through the saloon doors. The room quieted instantly. Men hunched over cards and whiskey turned their heads, studying him with wary eyes. In the corner, dressed in a fine coat that seemed out of place among the dust and smoke, sat Robert McAllister. His hair was streaked with grey, his frame heavy from years of comfort, but his eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Elias with recognition. "Well, if it ain't the mountain ghost himself," McAllister drawled, his voice carrying across the room. "What brings you down from your hole in the rocks?" Elias strode forward, boots striking the floorboard steady as a drum beat. "You know why I'm here." McAllister leaned back, sipping from a glass of brandy. "Can't say I do, though I've heard stories. Some fool pulled a child from the river. Sad thing, that." Elias's hand rested on the back of a chair, knuckles tight. "That child's got your mark hanging from her neck," the saloon murmured, men shifting uneasily. McAllister's eyes narrowed, though his smile stayed fixed. "Do you accuse me of something, Carter?" "I don't accuse," Elias said evenly. "I just see a girl near drowned, left for dead, wearing a locket with your initials. You want to explain that?" For a heartbeat, silence hung like a drawn gun. Then McAllister chuckled, low and dismissive. "Children vanish all the time on the frontier, wolves, sickness, rivers. It's a cruel world. If a locket turned up, well, trinkets travel." Elias studied him, searching for cracks. McAllister's denial rang hollow, but men like him thrived on silence and intimidation. One of the rancher's hired guns rose from a table, hand brushing the butt of his revolver. "Best watch your words, Carter. You're poking at things that don't concern you." Boone growled, teeth bared. Elias didn't flinch. His voice cut sharp. "If a child's life don't concern me, then nothing does." The tension thickened. McAllister lifted his hand, and the gunman hesitated, sinking back into his chair. The rancher's smile faded, replaced by steel. "You think you can stand in my way? You're one man, Carter. I have 100. Elias leaned in, voice low but carrying. "One man's enough if he's got nothing left to lose." The saloon held its breath. McAllister's jaw worked, but he didn't rise. Instead, he poured another glass of brandy, pretending indifference. Elias turned and walked out, Boone close, the weight of every eye following him. Outside, Clara rushed to him, relief flooding her face. "Did you tell him?" she whispered. Elias laid a hand on her shoulder. "I told him enough, but this ain't over." And deep down he knew McAllister's silence was not retreat. It was the quiet before a storm. The trail north wound through narrow canyons where shadows clung even at midday. Elias kept Clara close in the saddle, Boone trotting ahead with his nose to the dirt. Ever since the confrontation in the saloon, Elias expected trouble to follow. Trouble had a way of finding men like Robert McAllister, and by extension, anyone who stood in his way. The wind carried no birdsong that day, only the restless rustle of branches. Elias's eyes swept the ridges, every muscle taut. Clara felt it too. His unease bled into her silence. She held the saddle horn tightly, her cheek pressed against his chest. "Why are you so quiet?" she asked softly, breaking the stillness. "Because quiet keeps us breathing," Elias answered. Not a mile farther, Boone stiffened, ears sharp, growl rumbling low. Elias pulled the mule to a halt, scanning the rocks above. His hand slid to the rifle strapped across his lap. Then came the shout. "Carter!" "Step off that trail." Figures emerged from the cliffs. 3 riders, rifles glinting, blocking the path ahead. Another pair slid out from behind them, cutting off the retreat. Clara gasped, clutching Elias's arm. The leader rode forward, a broad man with a black beard streaked grey, his revolver loose in his grip. "Word is you've been keeping what ain't yours," he called. "Time to hand her over." Elias's voice rang steady, though his pulse hammered. "She's a child, not property," the man sneered. "She's McAllister's business, and business says she don't belong with you." Boone barked fiercely, hackles high. Clara buried her face against Elias, whispering, "Don't let them take me." Elias lowered his voice to her ear. "Hold tight, Clara. We ain't giving in." He spurred Amos forward, aiming for the narrowest gap between riders. Gunfire cracked, splinters flying from rocks beside them. Elias ducked low, shielding Clara with his body, rifle snapping to his shoulder. He fired once, the shot striking dirt near a rider's horse, sending the beast rearing. The man tumbled hard, his gun skittering away. "Cut him off!" another shouted, but Elias had already driven Amos through the chaos. Boone lunged at a rider's stirrup, teeth snapping, forcing the man to kick wildly. Clara clung to Elias with a cry as bullets whined past. The canyon turned into a storm of echoes, hooves pounding, shouts bouncing off stone. Elias fired again, striking a man's hat clean from his head, close enough to scare but not kill. He wasn't out for blood unless pressed. His only aim was escape. They broke free of the circle, racing down the rocky slope. The mule stumbled once but regained footing, spurred by Elias's command. Boone ran beside them, teeth bared, barking to keep the pursuers at bay. Shots chased them, but distance widened with every stride. The ambushers shouted, their voices growing faint behind the crash of hooves and rattling stone. Elias didn't slow until the canyon opened into a meadow, the river glinting ahead like a silver blade. At last, he pulled Amos to a halt, chest heaving, sweat soaking his shirt. Clara trembled against him, face pale, eyes wide with terror. Boone circled them, tongue lolling, his bark now triumphant. "Are they gone?" Clara whispered, voice cracking. "For now," Elias said, scanning the ridge. His voice was calm, but inside he burned with rage. Men had aimed rifles at a child, and that was a sin he would not forget. Clara lifted her head, eyes shining with tears. I thought they'd take me." Elias tightened his grip around her shoulders. "Not while I draw breath." The words came without hesitation, binding him as surely as any oath. He had chosen once to walk away from the world of guns and violence, but that world had come calling again, and for Clara's sake he knew he would answer. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, Elias urged Amos onward, deeper into the mountains. Yet even as they rode, he knew the ambush was only the beginning. The cabin felt smaller after the ambush, its walls too thin against the memory of rifles aimed from the cliffs. Elias sat at the table, oil lamp burning low, while Clara curled on the bunk with Boone stretched at her feet. Her eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling beams, restless as the wind outside. Finally she spoke. "Elias, if they come again, will we always have to run?" He looked at her, the weight of her question pressing like a millstone. "Sometimes running keeps you alive. Out here that's worth more than pride." She shook her head, her voice steadier now. "But I don't want to hide forever. I want to go home." The word struck him harder than any bullet. Elias leaned back, his hand rubbing the scar on his forearm. "Clara, you don't know what waits there. Home might not be the place you remember. Might be worse." She clutched the locket, fingers trembling. "I remember my mama's voice. I remember the house with the big porch. I remember laughter before it all went dark. That's home. And I can't forget it, even if it's gone." Elias's chest tightened. She was too young to know the cruelty of the world, yet old enough to cling to memory as truth. He wanted to tell her that some homes could never be reclaimed, that sometimes the past was a coffin best left closed. But when he saw the fire in her eyes, he knew words would not sway her. The next morning Clara followed him outside as he split wood. Her voice rang with resolve. "You promise not to leave me. If you stay with me, then help me find it. Please." He stopped mid-swing, the axe buried in the log. The mountain air stung his lungs as he breathed deep. "If I take you there, you'll be walking into danger. Men like McAllister don't let go easy." Clara met his gaze unflinching. "I don't care. I'd rather face danger than never know the truth." Her words echoed in his mind long after she went back inside. Elias had lived by his own code for years. Survive, endure, keep to the high country where no man's law reached. But Clara's code was simpler, sharper. She sought belonging, even if it meant walking into the lion's den. That night, as the fire burned low, she crawled onto the bench beside him. "Elias?" "Yes, girl?" "You told me once you'd keep me safe. Keeping me safe doesn't mean keeping me hidden. It means standing with me even if it's hard." Her words sliced through the silence. Elias stared at her, struck by how much she reminded him of Daniel. His son had once spoken with the same stubborn courage. He closed his eyes, feeling the ache of loss mingling with something new, something dangerously close to hope. "You're asking me to take you back," he said at last. I'm asking you to take me home, Clara replied firmly. Boone lifted his head then, as if punctuating her plea with a soft bark. Elias let out a long breath, staring into the flames. He had sworn never to carry another's burden, yet here was a child who had already taken root in his heart. "All right," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "We'll go. But you need to understand, what waits ahead may break more than it mends." Clara nodded, tears glistening but unfallen. "I'd rather know the truth than live in the dark." Elias reached across the firelight, resting a hand on hers. "Then truth is what we'll find. Together." The night deepened, wolves howling from the ridge. Clara leaned against him, her small body trembling yet her spirit unyielding. Elias stared into the dark beyond the cabin walls, knowing the path ahead would demand more than survival. It would demand courage neither of them could yet measure. When Elias and Clara rode once more into Fort Bridger, the air in town felt different, charged, heavy with expectation. News of the ambush had traveled fast, carried by riders and loose tongues. Everywhere Elias looked, men watched with narrowed eyes, some curious, others cautious. Boone growled under his breath, sensing the same tension. They tied Amos at the post near the general store. Clara stayed close to Elias, her hand gripping his coat sleeve. Martha Green stepped outside, her apron dusted with flour. Relief flickered across her face when she saw Clara alive, but her expression hardened when she turned to Elias. "You've stirred a hornet's nest," she whispered. "McAllister's men have been shouting their version of the story all week. If you mean to fight this in the open, you'd best be ready." Elias's eyes narrowed. "I didn't start this, Martha. But I'll finish it." By afternoon, the matter had spilled into the saloon, which doubled as a place of rough justice when no proper court could be called. The town's folk crowded in, ranch hands, traders, soldiers, even families drawn by curiosity. McAllister himself sat at a table near the center, flanked by hired guns. His fine coat and polished boots set him apart from the dust-stained men around him. Elias entered with Clara at his side, Boone pressing close. The room quieted, every gaze fixed on them. Clara's small hand trembled, but she did not let go. The barkeep, who often acted as mediator in such disputes, cleared his throat. "Seems we've got a quarrel in need of airing. A child pulled from the river, a claim she belongs to McAllister blood. Let's hear it straight." McAllister rose, his voice smooth as honey but edged with steel. "The girl is mine by right. She is my daughter, taken from me by misfortune. This man," he gestured toward Elias, "is a drifter, a gunman with a shadowed past. He seeks to use her for leverage, to tarnish my name." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Elias stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "She was no daughter safe in a bed. She was nailed in a crate, cast into the river like refuse. I pulled her out with my own hands. If that's McAllister's way of keeping his kin, then he's less father than butcher." Clara's voice, small but clear, broke the silence. "I remember," she said, clutching her locket. "I remember Mama's tears. I remember shouting, and then the crate closed." Gasps rippled through the room. Martha Green pushed her way to the front. "I've known the McAllister women. That child bears the face of Robert's first wife, God rest her soul. You can deny much, sir, but not blood." McAllister's jaw tightened, though his smile remained. "Idle talk, gossip spun by bitter old women. The word of a recluse and a child is hardly proof." But more townsfolk spoke up. A ranch hand stepped forward, hat in hand. "I worked McAllister's spread once. Heard the new wife curse the girl more than once, call her a curse on her own future. Wouldn't surprise me if she wanted the girl gone." The saloon grew loud, voices clashing, some siding with McAllister's wealth, others with the truth plain in Clara's eyes. Elias stood firm, one hand resting on her shoulder, the other steady on his belt. "Enough talk," McAllister thundered at last, his mask cracking. "This is my affair, not the town's." But the town had heard enough. For the first time, whispers no longer favored the rancher. The weight of testimony, the sight of Clara clutching her locket, shifted the tide. The barkeep raised his hand. This girl deserves more than shadows and whispers. Until truth is set plain, she stays under protection, not under McAllister's roof. The ruling was no law carved in stone, but it was enough. McAllister's face darkened, his pride stung before the eyes of the town. Elias knew it was only a reprieve. The frontier had no true courts, no lasting justice. What mattered now was survival, and McAllister would not let this insult rest. The storm broke on a Sunday morning, though no rain fell. It was a storm of men, pride, and truth. Elias knew it was coming the moment McAllister's hired guns rode into Fort Bridger in a line, dust rising behind them like smoke. Clara stood at the window of Martha Green's house, where Elias had taken her for safety. Her hand clutched the locket, eyes wide with fear. "Elias," she whispered, "he's here." Elias buckled his belt, revolver heavy at his hip, though his heart carried a weight far greater. He had tried to avoid violence, but the time for silence had passed. "Stay with Martha," he told Clara. "Whatever happens, don't leave her side." The saloon filled again, the whole town drawn into the clash they knew could not be delayed. McAllister entered first, boots polished, voice booming as if he already owned the outcome. His wife followed, a woman with cold eyes, lips pursed in disdain, a pearl brooch glittering at her collar. "Bring out the girl," McAllister demanded. "This farce has gone on long enough." Elias stepped forward before anyone else could answer. "She's here, and she's safe. But she won't be leaving with you." The saloon fell silent. McAllister's eyes narrowed, his voice lowering into something darker. "You think to stand between a father and his child? Who are you to challenge me, Carter?" Elias's voice carried steady, each word cutting through the air. "I'm the man who pulled her from the river. While you sat in your house of wealth, someone tried to bury her alive. And I reckon it wasn't fate that sealed that crate." Gasps rippled through the crowd. McAllister's wife stiffened, her eyes flashing before she masked them with practiced poise. Elias caught it, though, and pressed harder. Clara remembers her mother's tears. She remembers shouting. She remembers the crate closing. "You can deny it all you want, but the truth don't wash away in a river." Martha stepped forward, holding a letter she had kept for years. "This came from McAllister's first wife before she passed," she declared. "She wrote of fear, that her daughter might never be safe once she was gone. She begged that someone watch over Clara if harm ever came." The letter's words, scrawled in a trembling hand, rang like a bell of truth. McAllister's face reddened, but before he could speak, Clara's small voice cut through the room. "Papa," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "why didn't you protect me?" The rancher flinched as if struck. For the first time, the mask of power cracked, revealing a man cornered by his own shame. He glanced at his wife, whose lips twisted in scorn. She rose sharply, her voice venomous. "Because you were in the way. His fortune, his land, it all should pass to my son, not you. You were nothing but a mistake I intended to erase." The crowd erupted in shouts, outrage spilling over. McAllister's eyes blazed, not at Elias but at the woman beside him. He turned on her, voice rough. You did this." But the damage was done. The town had heard enough. Men who had once bowed to McAllister's power now muttered against him. The barkeep slammed his hand on the counter. "No more lies. We won't stand for children tossed into rivers for the sake of greed." McAllister sagged into his chair, defeated not by bullets, but by truth laid bare. His wife stormed out, shunned by the glares of every soul present. Elias stood still, Clara clinging to his side. He had spoken the truth, but truth came with a cost. McAllister's empire would not crumble in a day, yet his pride had been broken before all. And in the silence that followed, Elias knew the reckoning was not only for Clara, but for himself. He looked down at her, her eyes glistening but fierce. "You're safe now," he said, though his voice carried both promise and warning, because safety in the frontier was never permanent. The days after the saloon reckoning moved slow, the town stirring with the echo of truths too loud to ignore. Robert McAllister no longer carried himself with the same unshakable pride. His power remained, but it had been bruised before witnesses who would not forget. His wife had vanished from Fort Bridger in disgrace, leaving only whispers of her fury and the greed that had nearly drowned a child. Elias and Clara stayed in Martha Green's home for a time, the older woman fussing over the girl as if she were her own. Clara laughed more easily now, her smile less guarded, though at night she sometimes woke with tears clutching her locket. Each time Elias sat beside her until she calmed, his presence a steady anchor. One morning Clara sat at the table, her voice quiet but sure. "Elias, I don't want to live in McAllister's house. I don't care if he's my father. Home isn't made of walls and riches. Home is—" She hesitated, then looked at him with eyes that carried both fear and hope. "Home is where you are." The words struck deeper than any wound. Elias had spent years convincing himself he was meant for solitude, that his heart had no place left for ties. Yet Clara's gaze shattered that lie. He saw in her not just the child he had saved, but the family he thought forever lost. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Clara, the world won't make it easy for us. McAllister may be shamed, but men like him don't forget. You stay by me, you'll be walking a hard trail." She reached across the table, her small hand covering his. "I'd rather walk a hard trail with you than live easy without you." Boone thumped his tail against the floor as if agreeing. Elias managed a faint smile, the first that felt unburdened in years. That evening they left Martha's house together. The town watched them go, some offering nods of respect, others whispering in awe at the man who had stood against McAllister. Elias carried no pride in it. He carried only the knowledge that a child had chosen him as her family, and he had chosen her in return. Back at the cabin, life settled into a new rhythm. Clara helped gather kindling, stirred pots of stew, and tried her hand at sewing torn shirts with stitches crooked but earnest. Elias taught her to ride Amos properly, steadying her as she laughed in the open meadow. Each day bound them closer, not by blood, but by choice. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the peaks, Clara leaned against him near the fire. "Elias?" "Yes, girl. When you pulled me from the river, I thought I'd never feel safe again, but now—" She paused, pressing her locket tight. "Now I know I'm home." His throat tightened, but he only nodded, staring into the flames. For the first time in years, the memories of Sarah and Daniel brought not just grief, but also the quiet sense that maybe his heart still had room to carry love forward. Clara had given him that. The wilderness outside remained harsh, wolves howling in the distance, storms rolling over the ridges, but inside the cabin there was warmth, laughter, and the fragile beginnings of a new life. For those who have followed this story, remember this. Family is not always the blood that binds us, but the hands that reach for us when we are drowning. Elias Carter learned that truth when he lifted a child from the river, and in her voice he heard the one word that changed everything: home. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales of resilience and grit from the Old West. And before you go, click on the suggested video now on your screen to keep riding with us into another journey worth hearing.